Nobody laughed out loud.
You alright?
That is the thing
Better
people
than right.
always get wrong when they
Good.
tell this story later.
Because
They
they're
say the
staring
whole
hard
room
tonight.
laughed.
Let them stare.
They say people were cruel about it from the beginning.
She actually married him?
But that
I
is
heard
not
he's
exactly
seriously
how it
sick.
happened.
He must be rich.
What happened was
Maybe she
quieter
loves
than
him.
that.
Yeah, okay.
It was the kind of thing that spreads through a room without anyone saying a word out loud.
You alright?
A look held
Better
a
than
second
alright.
too long.
Good.
A smile that meant
Because they're
something other
staring
than
hard
happiness.
Let them stare.
A whisper between two
She's
women
definitely
near the
waiting
back
for
of the
inheritance
reception hall
money.
that stopped
He
the moment
probably
Rachel
won't
walked
last a
past.
year. You think
That
she
is
even
what
loves
happened.
him?
That is where
Come
this
on.
story actually begins. Not with cruelty. With something smaller and more corrosive than cruelty. With the quiet, collective certainty of people who believed they already understood exactly what they were looking at. They saw a 34-year-old woman in a simple white dress standing beside a 71-year-old man in a wheelchair. They saw an age gap of 37 years. They saw a man who needed help getting from the parking lot to the ceremony. They saw what they thought was obvious.
She heard
And
us.
not one of them, not a single person in that reception hall, thought
People
to ask what
usually
Raymond
say more
Caldwell
about
had spent the last
themselves
40
than
years
me.
building in silence. They should have asked. It would have saved them
Honestly,
a great deal of embarrassment.
She probably married him
Stay
before
with me.
hospice could.
And come
Because
for a
what happened
chuckle.
in the 12 months that
Proud
followed that
chuckle.
wedding is not the story most people tell. And the version most people tell leaves out the only part that actually matters. There is a particular kind of arrogance that comes dressed as concern. It does not announce itself as arrogance. It arrives with furrowed brows and gentle voices and sentences that begin with "I just worry about you." It sits across from you at family dinners and asks questions it has already decided the answers to. It sends text messages at 11 at night that say "Are you sure about this?" and mean something closer to "I have already decided you are making a mistake and I am giving you one more opportunity to agree with me before I say it plainly." Rachel Caldwell, who had been Rachel Moore for the 34 years before that wedding, had received those messages. She had sat through those dinners. She had answered those questions with a patience that cost her more than anyone watching understood. And she had married Raymond anyway. On a Tuesday afternoon in March, in a small ceremony at a private estate outside of Nashville, Tennessee, with 17 people in attendance, most of whom spent the reception believing they were watching a woman make the most significant mistake of her adult life. 12 months later, not one of those 17 people would use the word mistake. Some of them would not use any word at all, because the situation would have rendered them genuinely speechless. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because before you can understand what happened after that wedding, you have to understand who Rachel was, who Raymond was, and why the gap between what people assumed and what was actually true turned out to be one of the most expensive miscalculations any of those 17 guests ever made. Rachel Moore grew up in Clarksville, Tennessee. She was the middle child of 3, raised in a modest split-level house by parents who worked hard and expected the same of their children without ever needing to say so explicitly. Her father drove a delivery truck for 22 years. Her mother worked the front desk at a medical practice and knew every patient by name and remembered their children's birthdays without writing them down. Rachel inherited her mother's memory and her father's work ethic, and neither of those things made her life particularly easy, but both of them made her extremely good at her job. She had worked in elder care management for 11 years by the time she met Raymond. She had started as a floor coordinator at a residential care facility in Nashville, moved into administrative oversight within 3 years, and by the time she was 32 she was running a regional coordination program that managed care planning for 7 separate facilities across Middle Tennessee. She was not wealthy. She drove a 6-year-old Subaru and rented a 2-bedroom apartment in
Somebody
East
had a rough
Nashville
day.
that she shared with a rescue dog named Harold and a collection of paperback novels she kept organized by author last name. She cooked on Sundays. She called her mother every Thursday.
That sounded terrible.
She had a group of 3 close friends she had known since college, and she saw them on the first Saturday of every month without fail for 11 years. She was, in every measurable way, a grounded, practical, quietly exceptional person who had never once in her adult life made a major decision without thinking it through completely. The people who described her marriage to Raymond as impulsive did not know Rachel. The people who described it as financially motivated knew her even less. She met Raymond Caldwell on a Tuesday in October, 14 months before the wedding. He had been referred to her program by his primary care physician following a series of health complications that had made his existing independent living arrangements genuinely untenable. Raymond had a degenerative joint condition that had been progressing for 8 years, 2 cardiac events in the previous 3 years, and a stubbornness about accepting help that his physician described in the referral notes as extraordinary even by the standards of this particular patient population. Rachel had read those notes on a Wednesday morning with her second cup of coffee and had underlined the word extraordinary with her pen, not because it surprised her. She had worked with thousands of patients in 11 years and stubbornness in men of Raymond's generation was not uncommon, but because something in the specific phrasing of the physician's notes suggested this particular stubbornness was not rooted in pride. It was rooted in something else. She went to meet him the following Tuesday. She drove to the address on file, which was a house in a quiet neighborhood in Brentwood, parked her Subaru in the driveway beside a car that had not been moved in what appeared to be several months based on the layer of pine needles accumulated on the hood, walked to the front door, and knocked. Raymond opened the door himself. He was using a walker that morning, which his physician had noted he often refused to use when he believed someone was evaluating his condition. The fact that he was using it told Rachel something about his honesty that she filed away before they had exchanged a single word. He looked at her for a moment and then said, "I don't need a babysitter." Rachel looked back at him and said, "Good. Because I don't babysit." He smiled at that. She came inside. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And please hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming stories on Dark Mind Tales. This community means everything to us and we read every single comment you leave. Raymond Caldwell had been born in 1951 in a small town in eastern Kentucky that most people outside of that county had never heard of and still have not. His father worked in the coal industry. His mother raised 4 children in a house that had good bones and bad insulation, and Raymond had learned before he was 10 years old that the world did not give you things and that waiting for it to do so was the specific variety of foolishness that kept families poor across generations. He had left eastern Kentucky at 18 with $200 and a duffel bag and a clarity of purpose that people who met him in those early years described as almost unsettling in a person that young. He had not gone to college. He had gone to work. He had started in construction in Nashville in 1969, laboring on commercial projects through the early 1970s while watching, with the particular attention of a man who intends to understand a system rather than simply participate in it, how the money actually moved in commercial real estate development. He had saved. He had read. He had asked questions of people who had no reason to answer them and had been persistent enough that some of them did anyway. In 1978 he had bought his first commercial property, a small industrial building in a part of Nashville that nobody considered desirable at the time, for a price that reflected the general indifference of the market toward that particular location. He had held it. In 1983 he had bought a second one. In 1987 a third. He had continued in this manner, quietly and without any particular public profile, for the next 3.5 decades.
I wouldn't know how.
He had never sought attention. He had never spoken to journalists. He had never appeared on any list of notable Tennessee businesspeople, not because he lacked the qualifications but because he declined to participate in the process of compiling such lists when approached. By the time Rachel Moore knocked on his front door in October, Raymond Caldwell's commercial real estate holdings in Middle Tennessee were valued by his accountants at slightly over $400 million. He had no children. He had been married once, briefly, in the 1980s, a marriage that had ended without bitterness and produced no heirs and left him, by his own description in one of the later interviews he reluctantly gave, with a very clear understanding of what I was and was not prepared to offer another person at that point in my life. He had not remarried. He had not, by most external appearances, come close to it. And then Rachel Moore had stood on his front porch and said, "Good, because I don't babysit," and something shifted in Raymond Caldwell that had not shifted in a very long time. Their relationship did not begin romantically. That matters, and it is worth being specific about, because the version of this story that travels the furthest tends to flatten the 14 months between their first meeting and the wedding into something that sounds either calculated or impulsive depending on who is telling it. Neither version is accurate. What actually happened was a professional relationship that became a genuine friendship that became, over the course of approximately 8 months, something that neither of them had words for immediately because neither of them had expected it. Rachel visited Raymond as part of her professional case load twice a week for the first 3 months. They talked, during those visits, about his care needs and his living situation and the modifications that would make his home safer and his daily life more manageable. They also talked, during those visits, about a great many other things. Raymond had read extensively for 50 years and had opinions about almost everything, and the particular quality that Rachel noticed about those opinions was that they were grounded in specific information rather than general conviction, which was rarer in her experience than it should have been. Raymond noticed, during those visits, that Rachel listened the way very few people listen, not waiting for her turn to speak, not organizing her response while he was still talking, but actually receiving what he said before deciding what she thought about it. He had not had many conversations of that quality in recent years. He had not realized how much he missed them until they started happening again. By the 4th month Rachel was staying an hour past her scheduled visit time on a regular basis. By the 6th month Raymond had begun, in a manner he would later describe as entirely out of character for him, looking forward to Tuesdays and Thursdays in a way that had nothing to do with care coordination. By the 8th month they were both aware of something that neither of them had addressed directly, which is the specific kind of awareness that tends to occupy considerably more mental space than things that have been addressed directly. Raymond addressed it first. He did it in the way that men of his generation and temperament tend to do such things, directly, without performance, and with a complete absence of romantic staging. He simply told her, one Thursday afternoon while she was reviewing his medication schedule at his kitchen table, that he was aware their relationship had become something other than professional and that if she did not share that assessment he would respect it completely and they would return to the prior arrangement without difficulty, but that he wanted her to know where he stood rather than allow ambiguity to persist because ambiguity was, in his view, the primary cause of most preventable human misery. Rachel put down the medication schedule. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I know. I've been waiting for you to say something for 2 months." Raymond said, "I was being cautious." Rachel said, "I noticed." They were married 6 months later. The 17 people at the wedding represented the closest members of both their lives. On Rachel's side there were her parents, her 2 siblings, her 3 college friends, and 4 colleagues from her professional network who had known her for the better part of a decade. On Raymond's side there were 2 men who had been his business associates and genuine friends for 30 years, his attorney, 2 distant cousins who had maintained intermittent contact with him over the years, and his housekeeper of 14 years, a woman named Gloria who had been invited not as staff but as someone Raymond considered, in his plain-spoken way, one of the 3 or 4 people in his life he actually trusted. These 17 people represented, in their reactions to the wedding, a fairly complete spectrum of the ways human beings respond to something they do not understand and have not been given adequate context to evaluate. Rachel's parents were politely concerned. Her mother pulled her aside the morning of the wedding and said, in the gentle and slightly anguished voice of a woman who loves her daughter completely and is trying very hard to say something difficult without causing damage, "Honey, are you absolutely certain about this?" And Rachel had taken her mother's hands and said, "Mom, I have never been more certain about anything in my life." And her mother had nodded and looked at her for a long moment and said, "All right," and had not raised it again. Rachel's siblings were less restrained in the weeks before the wedding and somewhat more restrained after it, which is a trajectory that would become more pronounced as the year progressed. Her 3 college friends had a group text conversation about the situation that Rachel never saw but that covered approximately 40 messages and included the phrases "What is she thinking? He could go any day," and "I just hope she knows what she is doing," which was a phrase that in context meant something closer to "I am fairly confident she does not know what she is doing." Raymond's business associates accepted the marriage with the equanimity of men who had known Raymond for 30 years and understood that when Raymond Caldwell decided something, the decision was made and the discussion was over. His attorney, a man named Thomas Whitaker who had handled Raymond's affairs for 22 years, said nothing at the wedding but made a series of phone calls in the following week that resulted in a comprehensive review of Raymond's estate planning documents, which was the professional response of a man who understood exactly what the marriage meant in financial terms and intended to make sure all of it was properly documented. Gloria cried during the ceremony. She told Rachel afterward that Raymond had not smiled the way he smiled that afternoon in at least 15 years. Rachel had held Gloria's hands and had not trusted herself to respond. The whispers started at the reception and did not stop for several months. This is the part of the story that the people involved are least comfortable discussing now, for obvious reasons, but it is also the part that is most important to understand if you want to comprehend what happened 12 months later and why it landed the way it did. The specific content of the whispers was not unusual. It was, in fact, entirely predictable, which is one of the things that made it so corrosive. People said she was after his money. People said he was lonely and she had taken advantage of that loneliness in a professional context which made it worse, not better. People said it would not last, and by not last they meant Raymond would die and Rachel would collect and move on, which was a version of events that required believing Rachel had calculated the entire previous 14 months and had felt nothing genuine during any of it. Rachel's older brother, a man named David who worked in insurance in Memphis and had strong opinions about most things, said to his wife at the reception in a voice that was not quite as quiet as he believed, "I just hope she got a good prenup," and laughed in a way that meant something other than humor. None of these people knew that Raymond had no intention of requiring a prenuptial agreement. None of them knew what Raymond's estate was worth. None of them knew anything beyond what they could see, which was an age gap and a wheelchair and the story they had already decided to tell about those two things. And not one of them, in all the weeks and months of whispers and concerned phone calls and pointed questions, had thought to ask Rachel a single question about who Raymond Caldwell actually was. They had assumed they knew. Assumption is almost always the most expensive mistake a person can make, and it is almost always the mistake that feels the most justified in the moment. The first 12 months of the marriage were not what most of the 17 wedding guests expected. They had expected, at some level, a marriage defined by caregiving and management and the particular domestic gravity of declining health. They had expected Rachel to be, in the language of the politely concerned, a devoted companion to a man in his final years. What they did not expect was a marriage that looked, from the inside, like the most genuine partnership either person had ever experienced. Raymond's health was serious. That was real and it was not minimized or romanticized. There were difficult days. There were medical appointments that lasted most of a morning and produced results that required careful processing. There were nights when Raymond's pain was significant enough to make sleep difficult and mornings that began slowly and required patience and care. Rachel provided that care without treating it as a burden, because she had spent 11 years developing the specific capacity to provide that kind of care without losing herself in the providing of it, which is a skill that looks simple from the outside and is in fact extraordinarily difficult to sustain. But the difficult days were not the shape of the marriage. They were part of it, the way difficult days are part of any honest life, but they were not its definition. What defined the marriage was something that surprised even Rachel, which was the specific quality of ease she felt in Raymond's company. She had not anticipated feeling at ease. She had anticipated something more like tenderness combined with purpose, which would have been enough and would have been real. What she actually felt was the ease of being entirely known by another person and finding that the knowing did not reduce you but expanded something. Raymond had spent 50 years learning how to see things clearly, and that capacity extended to people. He saw Rachel clearly. He saw what she was good at and he respected it without requiring her to perform it for him. He saw what was difficult for her and he did not use it as leverage. He was, in the specific vocabulary of people who have spent time with genuinely good human beings, exactly what he appeared to be. Rachel's mother visited 6 weeks after the wedding and called Rachel's father from the car on the way home and said, "I think I had it wrong," and her father said, "What do you mean?" and her mother said about Raymond, "I had it wrong." The financial reality of the marriage began to become visible to the 17 wedding guests in stages. The first stage was gradual and arrived through ordinary channels. Rachel stopped driving the 6-year-old Subaru. She moved out of the East Nashville apartment, which was expected since she was now living with Raymond at his house in Brentwood, but the house in Brentwood turned out to be considerably more substantial than anyone had understood from the address alone. Rachel's college friend Melissa, who visited 3 months after the wedding, called the other 2 friends from the guest bathroom to describe what she was seeing, and the description required several minutes and covered both the architectural details and what Melissa described as an art collection that looked seriously significant, which was accurate because it was. Raymond had been buying American art quietly for 30 years, and the collection in that house was documented and valued and considered by the 2 specialists who had examined it to be one of the more significant private collections of American realist painting in the southeastern United States. None of the 17 wedding guests had known this. None of them had known about the commercial real estate. None of them had known about the investment portfolio that Thomas Whitaker managed with the help of a small family office Raymond had established in 2003. They had seen a man in a wheelchair and they had made their calculations accordingly. The calculations had been wrong by approximately $400 million. The moment that changed everything for the 17 wedding guests, the moment that moved this from a private financial reality to something they could no longer ignore or privately dismiss, came 8 months into the marriage, in a form that none of them had anticipated. Raymond's health had been declining through the summer months, not catastrophically but measurably, in the way that the health of a 71-year-old man with his specific conditions tends to decline through a hot Tennessee summer. He had been hospitalized twice, briefly, for monitoring and adjustment of his medications. He had begun spending more time at home and less time on the phone, which Thomas Whitaker recognized as a meaningful change in a man who had conducted most of his business by telephone for 40 years. In September, Raymond asked Thomas to come to the house for a meeting. Gloria served coffee. Rachel sat beside Raymond at the dining room table. Thomas sat across from them with a legal pad and the particular carefully neutral expression of an attorney who has been in this kind of meeting before and understands that his job is to execute, not to react. Raymond spoke for approximately 40 minutes. He covered the restructuring of his estate plan, the establishment of a new series of trusts, the disposition of various real estate assets, and a charitable endowment he had been considering for several years and had decided to formalize. He spoke with the clarity and precision of a man who had been thinking about this for a long time and had no interest in being vague about any of it. When he finished, Thomas reviewed his notes, asked 3 clarifying questions, received 3 direct answers, and said he would have the revised documents prepared within 10 days. Raymond said that was fine. Gloria refilled the coffee. The meeting ended. None of the 17 wedding guests knew this meeting had taken place. They would find out, in the way these things are eventually found out, some months later. And when they did, the number attached to Rachel's name in those documents would be the last thing any of them had expected to see. The whispers, which had never entirely stopped, began to change character around the 9th month of the marriage. Part of this was the visible reality of Rachel's daily life, which had become difficult to characterize as the calculated performance of a woman in pursuit of money, because calculated performances of that kind require a distance and a detachment that Rachel simply did not exhibit. She was present. She was attentive. She took Raymond to his appointments and stayed for them and asked the doctors questions that his doctors later described to each other as the most substantive questions any family member had ever asked them about this particular patient's condition. She managed his care with the professional competence of someone who had spent 11 years doing exactly this kind of work, and she did it without any of the resignation or visible burden that tends to accumulate in people providing care under duress. She clearly liked Raymond. Not performed liking. Not strategic warmth. The kind of liking that shows up in small, unobservable moments, the way she passed him things before he asked for them, the way she laughed at things he said in rooms where no one else was present to notice, the way she sat near him in the evenings without the particular tension of a person who is somewhere they would rather not be. Rachel's mother visited again in October and afterward told her husband, with the particular directness of a woman who is correcting a previous assessment as fully as she is able, that she had been wrong about more than Raymond. She had been wrong about the whole thing. Her husband said, "What do you mean?" and she said, "I mean Rachel knew exactly what she was doing. She just wasn't doing what we thought she was doing." He thought about that for a moment and said, "I think you're right," and his wife said, "I know I am," and that was the end of the conversation. Raymond died in February, 11 months after the wedding. He died at home, which was what he had wanted, on a morning that had started with coffee and had included, according to Gloria who was present, a conversation about a book Raymond had been reading and a period of quiet that was not distressed quiet but the specific quality of quiet that comes when a person is comfortable and still. Rachel was beside him. Gloria was in the kitchen. The moment was peaceful in the way that deaths at home in the company of people who love you are sometimes peaceful, which is to say it was not without grief but it was not without grace either. Raymond was 72 years old. He had lived a life of extraordinary productivity and extraordinary privacy, and he had spent his last 11 months in the company of a person who had seen him clearly and stayed. Rachel did not make any public statements in the days following Raymond's death. She arranged the service, a small private ceremony attended by the same 17 people who had been at the wedding plus Thomas Whitaker and Gloria and several of Raymond's longest business associates who had not attended the wedding but who came now and whose presence said something about the regard in which Raymond was held by people who had known him for decades. Rachel stood at the front of that room and spoke for 7 minutes about a man she had known for 25 months, and her description of him was so specific and so honest and so clearly the description of a person she had genuinely known rather than a performance of grief for an audience that several people in that room who had known Raymond for 30 years said afterward that she had captured something they had never been able to articulate themselves. David, Rachel's older brother, who had made the prenup joke at the reception, did not speak at the service. He stood in the back of the room and looked at the floor and said nothing. Thomas Whitaker called Rachel 3 weeks after the service. He asked if she was ready to meet about Raymond's estate and she said she was, and they met in Thomas's office the following Tuesday morning. Thomas had been an estate attorney for 28 years. He had delivered financial news of various kinds to various people across those 28 years, and he had developed, through the accumulation of that experience, a fairly reliable ability to predict how a person would receive information. He had expected Rachel to receive the information well. He had not expected her to receive it the way she actually did, which was with a long silence followed by a series of very specific and very practical questions about the structure of the trusts and the obligations attached to various assets and the timeline for various transfers. No tears. No visible shock beyond the initial silence. Practical questions, asked in the order a person asks questions when they are actually thinking rather than reacting. Thomas answered every question directly, and when the meeting ended and Rachel thanked him and left, he sat in his office for a few minutes and thought about the fact that in 28 years of practice he had never had a beneficiary respond to information of that magnitude with that level of composure and that caliber of question. He thought about what that said about who Rachel was. He thought it said quite a lot. The total value of what Raymond had left Rachel, through the trusts, the real estate holdings, the investment portfolio, and the art collection, net of the charitable endowment and the various bequests to Gloria and to Raymond's 2 longtime business associates, was approximately $340 million. Rachel Moore, who had driven a 6-year-old Subaru and organized her paperback novels by author last name and called her mother every Thursday, was now one of the wealthiest private individuals in the state of Tennessee. Nobody who had whispered at the wedding was laughing now. Nobody who had sent the concerned text messages was offering their analysis now. The silence from those corners was so complete it had its own texture. The silence was not the only response, of course. There were other responses, some of which were more honest than others and some of which were considerably less honest than others. Rachel's brother David called her 6 weeks after the estate meeting. The call lasted 22 minutes and covered a considerable amount of ground, including an apology that Rachel received with more grace than it probably deserved, given its content, which was an apology for the prenup joke specifically rather than for the broader pattern of assumption that had produced it. Rachel accepted the apology. She was her mother's daughter. Her 3 college friends had a different text thread now, in which the word incredible appeared multiple times in ways that had nothing to do with skepticism. Several of the 17 wedding guests who had been most vocal in their private concern found reasons, in the months following the estate settlement, to reach out to Rachel in ways that were friendly and warm and which Rachel received with the same composure she seemed to bring to everything. She did not hold the prior opinions against anyone in any visible way. She also did not pretend the prior opinions had not existed. She was simply exactly who she had been before the money and before the wedding and before the whispers, which is the most remarkable thing about this entire story and the thing that is most easily lost if you tell it only as a story about money. Rachel spent the 14 months following Raymond's death making decisions about the estate that reflected both who she was and what she had learned from Raymond about how to hold significant resources without being distorted by them. She completed the charitable endowment Raymond had established and expanded it, directing an additional $30 million toward a foundation focused on elder care access in rural Tennessee, a cause that connected, directly and explicitly, to the 11 years she had spent working in that field before she ever met Raymond. She retained the commercial real estate portfolio, hiring the management team Raymond had trusted for 20 years to continue operating it, and invested a portion of the returns in improvements to facilities in neighborhoods that Raymond had identified in his notes as underserved. She kept the house in Brentwood. She kept Harold the rescue dog. She still called her mother every Thursday. Gloria remained in the house, not as an employee in any formal sense, but as what she had been since the wedding, someone Rachel trusted and valued and wanted present in her daily life. Thomas Whitaker continued to handle the estate's legal affairs. At a dinner with Thomas 9 months after the estate meeting, at a restaurant neither of them had been to before, Rachel said something that Thomas later repeated to his wife because he could not stop thinking about it. She said, "The thing that most people got wrong about Raymond was that they assumed his wealth was the most important thing about him. It wasn't even in the top 5. Thomas asked her what was in the top 5. She thought about it for a moment and then listed them. The way he listened. The fact that he never said anything he didn't mean. The way he worked without needing anyone to acknowledge the work. The way he was honest about what he didn't know. And the way he treated Gloria." Thomas thought about those 5 things on the drive home. He thought they were an accurate description of Raymond. He also thought they were an accurate description of Rachel. He did not think that was a coincidence. There is a question that the people who were at that wedding carry with them now, whether they admit it openly or not. It is not the question they thought they would be carrying. They thought the question would be something about money and calculation and whether Rachel had known what she was getting into. That is not the question. The question they actually carry is a quieter one, and it is the question that this story was always actually about, underneath the numbers and the estate and the silence that replaced the whispers. The question is this. When you looked at Raymond Caldwell in that wheelchair on that Tuesday afternoon in March and decided, in under 30 seconds, that you understood exactly what you were looking at, what was that decision actually about? Because it was not about Raymond. Raymond had not changed. Raymond was exactly what he had always been. The decision was about what you were willing to see when you looked at something that did not match the shape of your expectations. And the answer to that question, the honest answer, is the same for most of the people in that room. They were willing to see what required the least effort. They were willing to see the surface because the surface was familiar and the surface confirmed what they already believed about age and money and the kinds of decisions young women make. They were not willing to do what Rachel had done, which was to walk into a room, put down her assumptions at the door, and look at the actual person sitting in front of her. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. The cost of the alternative, the cost of the whispers and the text messages and the jokes in quiet voices at reception halls, turned out, in this case, to be $340 million and a marriage that several people who attended the wedding have since described, with the particular honesty that arrives late and costs nothing, as one of the most genuine things they ever witnessed. They said that after. Not during. After. Which is, unfortunately, when most people say the true thing. Rachel still drives the same model of car she drove before the marriage. Not the same car, that one had 200,000 miles on it and a heating system that had needed replacing for 3 years, but the same model. Her friends noticed this and one of them, the most direct of the 3, asked her why and Rachel said because I liked it and I was driving it before any of this and I don't see any reason to change it now. Her friend thought about that for a moment and then said that is the most you thing you have ever said and Rachel laughed, the real kind of laugh, the kind that means something. She visits Raymond's grave on the 15th of every month. She brings no flowers. She sits for a few minutes in whatever weather happens to be present that day. She does not perform the visit for anyone because no one is there to see it. She simply shows up, the way she always showed up, because Raymond was a person she valued, and valuing someone does not stop when they are no longer present to receive it directly. The foundation she established in his name has, in its first year of operation, funded expanded care coordination programs in 11 rural Tennessee counties. The name on the foundation is Raymond's. The work inside it is, in its specificity and its focus and its understanding of what the people it serves actually need, entirely Rachel's. Gloria is still in the house. Harold is still on the couch. The paperback novels are still organized by author last name. And somewhere in a reception hall in Nashville, on a Tuesday afternoon in March that is now almost 3 years gone, a version of 17 people is still standing with drinks in their hands, whispering things they were certain were true. They were not true. They were never true. They were just the story that required the least effort to believe. The other story, the true one, required something those 17 people were not prepared to offer on that particular afternoon. It required them to look more carefully. It required them to be wrong. It required them to ask the question they had already decided they knew the answer to. Most people, when faced with that requirement, choose the easier story. Rachel Moore did not choose the easier story. And the life she built as a result of that refusal is the only answer this story was ever going to give. Before you go, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly before you answer in the comments. When was the last time you looked at a person or a situation and made a decision about what you were seeing before you had earned the right to make that decision? Not out of cruelty. Not out of bad intentions. Just out of the ordinary human tendency to reach for the familiar story because the familiar story requires less of you. Because that is what happened in that reception hall. Nobody there was a bad person. They were just people who looked at something that did not fit their expectations and chose the explanation that required the least effort. The cost of that choice, in this case, was extraordinary. In most cases it is quieter and slower and harder to measure, but it is still a cost. Drop your answer in the comments. Tell me what you think you would have seen if you had been in that room. I genuinely want to know. And if this story stayed with you the way I think it will, subscribe to Dark Mind Tales and hit the notification bell, because the next story we are bringing you involves a family that spent 20 years building something in secret in a single afternoon that dismantled every assumption the people around them had spent 20 years constructing. You do not want to miss it. I will see you there.